If becoming king meant marrying your own niece, would you do it? This isn't just a question, it's the reality of one of history's most powerphul monarchs. A man who built an empire on coffins and sealed his dynasty's fate in the marriage bed. The story of a monarch whose crown was secured not only through battles and treaties, but through marriages that blurred the line between dynasty and deformity. A man who ruled the empire where the sun never set, yet passed on one of history's most devastating genetic legacies. That man was Philip II of Spain. Born in 1527, the son of Emperor Charles V and Isabella of Portugal, Philip inherited more than just a throne. He inherited the crushing weight of the Habsburg dynasty, a family convinced that its blood was too sacred to be mixed with outsiders. To the Habsburgs, marriage was not love. It was strategy. Each wedding was a political treaty sealed in flesh, and the tighter they pulled their family tree together, the more fragile its branches became. Philip grew up in an atmosphere of discipline, duty, and religion. Unlike his father, Charles V, who had spent his reign on horseback commanding armies across Europe, Philip was designed to be a king of the desk, a ruler who lived in paperwork, decrees, and faith. He was austere, almost monk-like, deeply devoted to Catholicism, and firmly tied to the machinery of the Spanish Inquisition. He would be remembered as the paper king, ruling more by pen than by sword. But his true legacy was written in the bedroom, not the chancery. Philip's first marriage came in 1543, when he was just 16. His bride was Maria Manuela of Portugal, his first cousin. The union was celebrated as the first step toward a united Iberian peninsula. But behind the pageantry lurked tragedy. Within 2 years, Maria was dead, her body broken by childbirth, her baby stillborn. Philip, not yet a man, was already a widower, already a victim of the dynasty's obsession with blood purity. In the Habsburg world, love didn't die first. At 27, he tried again. This time, the bride was Mary Tudor, Queen of England, the infamous Bloody Mary. Their marriage was not born of affection but of politics. Mary was desperate for an heir, Philip was desperate for England. Their union, intended to fuse two Catholic powers against Protestantism, became a source of deep resentment in England. Mary endured false pregnancies, phantom signs of life in a womb that betrayed her. When she died in 1558, Philip lost more than a wife. He lost his chance at the English crown. By then, Philip was no stranger to disappointment. But dynastic duty left no room for grief. Europe demanded alliances, and alliances demanded wives. In 1559, he married Elizabeth of Valois, the French king's daughter. She was 14. Philip was 32. To the French, the marriage was a peace treaty after years of bloody wars. To Philip, Elizabeth represented hope, a young, fertile bride who could finally give him the son his empire needed. For a time, it seemed to work. Elizabeth gave him 2 daughters and filled the Spanish court with a rare sense of warmth. Chroniclers wrote that Philip, often cold and rigid, softened in her presence. But fate was merciless. In 1568, Elizabeth died in childbirth at just 23 years old. Once again, Philip buried a wife. Once again, the cradle remained empty of the male heir Spain so desperately awaited. 3 marriages, 3 graves, and still no lasting son. The dynasty was faltering. The empire stretched from the Americas to Asia, but its future rested on the fragile bodies of royal brides. Philip, now in his 40s, turned to the only solution the Habsburgs ever trusted: family. And so began the most infamous chapter of his life: marriages not just within his dynasty, but to his own nieces. The court whispered, could Spain's destiny collapse not by war, but by biology? The solution, at least for the Habsburgs, was predictable. When outside marriages failed, they turned inward. The dynasty's obsession with keeping its bloodline pure meant that cousins, uncles, nieces, even siblings, were considered viable options. To them, the family tree was not meant to expand but to curl back upon itself like a snake eating its own tail. In 1570, Philip chose his 4th bride, Anna of Austria. She was 20 years old. She was also his niece, the daughter of his own sister, Maria of Austria, and his first cousin Maximilian II, the Holy Roman Emperor. In the logic of dynasties, this was not scandal. It was strategy. Marrying Anna reinforced Spain's alliance with Austria and gave Philip another chance at the son he craved. But behind the curtain of politics was something far stranger. Imagine the wedding. A man of 43, weary, stiff with gout, his body swelling with disease. Beside him, a bride half his age, raised from childhood to accept that her destiny was not hers, but her family's. Anna was not marrying a man. She was marrying an empire. At first, court observers noted, she brought light into Philip's life. Unlike his previous wives, Anna had grown up within the Habsburg circle, familiar with its rituals, its claustrophobic sense of duty. She was pious, dutiful, and submissive, the perfect match for a king who saw himself less as a husband than as God's instrument on earth. And she delivered what no other wife had: sons. 4 boys were born of their union. 3 died young, victims of the fragile genetics that plagued the Habsburg line. But 1 survived, Philip III, the long-awaited male heir. For a dynasty obsessed with continuity, it was a triumph. For Spain, it was the beginning of decline masked as success. Because with Philip III came not vigor but weakness. He was sickly, sheltered, and unprepared for rule. And the price of producing him was steep. Anna's own health broke under the strain of repeated pregnancies. She died in 1580 at just 30 years old, leaving Philip once more in mourning. Yet her death did not close the chapter of Habsburg inbreeding, it deepened it. For Philip II, however, the consequences of his choices were not yet visible. All he knew was that he had finally secured his heir. But the cost of that heir, the marriage to his niece, the deaths of so many children, was already sealing Spain's fate. Behind the grandeur of empire, behind the palaces and processions, the Habsburg dynasty was building its own coffin, brick by brick, marriage by marriage. By the 1580s, Philip II no longer looked like the golden monarch of Spain's triumphs. The decades of rule, war, and grief had carved deep lines into his face. His sense of divine mission only grew. It was in these years that Philip built his most enduring monument, Escorial. Part palace, part monastery, part mausoleum, this massive granite complex rose out of the dry Castilian plain like a fortress of faith. Its corridors were cold, its towers austere, its walls deliberately stripped of luxury. It was a tomb in advance, a mirror of Philip's own soul, severe, pious, unyielding. Inside, Philip lived almost like a monk. His days revolved around paperwork, prayer, and pain. He saw himself less as a king than as God's steward, chosen to defend Catholicism against heresy. The Inquisition flourished under his watch. Protestant books were burned. Suspects were tortured in secret chambers. Philip believed that the purity of his empire's faith justified cruelty, just as the purity of his dynasty justified incest. Torture chambers and marriage beds, they were both tools of the same empire, both soaked in silence and blood. But while Philip built stone walls and burned heretics, his empire began to fray. In 1588 he launched his most ambitious project, the Spanish Armada, a fleet designed to invade Protestant England and crush Elizabeth I. It was meant to be a holy war at sea, a crusade to restore Catholic order. Instead, storms and English fire ships reduced the Armada to drifting wrecks. Thousands of sailors drowned. The invincible fleet became a graveyard of hubris. For the first time, Spain looked weak. Enemies celebrated. Yet Philip, cloistered in El Escorial, refused to see it as defeat. He told himself it was God's will, that the failure was divine judgment rather than human error. His belief in destiny remained unshaken, even as the world around him shifted. At home, his court was suffocating. El Escorial's stone walls echoed with silence. Tapestries muted the light, and incense clung to the air. Visitors spoke of corridors that felt like prisons, of a king who appeared more corpse than man. Philip rarely laughed, rarely smiled. His only comfort came from relics, bones of saints, splinters of the true cross, objects he kept close as if their holiness could shield him from decay. By the 1590s, his empire still stretched across oceans, but its master was a prisoner of his own body. This was Philip II in his final decade, a man who had buried 4 wives, countless children, and much of Europe under his wars. A man who had defended Catholicism with fire and sword only to see Spain decline. A man who had married his niece to preserve his dynasty only to pass on sickness as his legacy. And as death closed in, Spain's most powerful king found himself trapped in the same silence he had imposed on others. In the summer of 1598, he ruled until the last possible breath. On September 13, 1598, after weeks of agony, Philip II finally died. He had been king for 42 years, longer than any European monarch of his era. His death was both a release and a revelation. The empire he left behind was vast, but already stretched too thin. His victories were stained by failures, his faith by cruelty, his dynasty by rot. For centuries, Spain remembered him as the architect of the Golden Age. Painters like El Greco filled his palaces with visions of heaven. Poets called him the champion of Catholicism. But behind the triumphal portraits lay the truth. Philip II had not secured the future. He had cursed it. The cost of his marriages, especially to his niece Anna of Austria, would not appear in his lifetime, but in the generations that followed. His son, Philip III, survived to inherit the crown, but he was weak, indecisive, and unfit for rule. Under him, Spain's power waned. Wars dragged on, silver fleets dwindled, and corruption hollowed out the empire. It was Philip II's obsession with blood purity, with keeping the dynasty locked within itself, that set this tragedy in motion. The marriages that were meant to secure the empire ensured its collapse instead. Power had been preserved in the short term, but the long game was lost. The Habsburgs had mistaken incest for strength, and in doing so, they signed their own death warrant. Today, when we look at portraits of the Habsburg kings, with their elongated jaws, their pale, sickly faces, we are looking at the ghost of Philip II. His reign built monuments, crushed rebellions, and sent ships across oceans. But his true legacy is not carved in stone or painted on canvas. It is written in bone and blood, in the fragile heirs who limped through history until they could limp no more. So when you hear of Spain's so-called Golden Age, remember the shadows in its palaces, the stench in its bedrooms, and the king who married not 1, but 2 nieces to preserve a dynasty that was already rotting. An empire may stretch across oceans, but blood cannot be stretched forever. Tell me, was Philip II's greatest mistake his faith in God, or his faith in incest? If this story made you rethink power, dynasty, and the hidden costs of empire, don't let it end here. Like, share, and subscribe, and tell me, was Philip II's greatest mistake his faith in God, his faith in incest, or was he simply cursed from the start?